Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on PFAS compounds and the toxics release inventory, new reporting obligations from the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. My name is Melissa Hart. I am one of the speakers today, and I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. During the webinar, you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar question or chat option. We will do our best to answer each question submitted as time permits. If we aren't able to get to your question during the live broadcast, we will follow up with you directly afterwards. We will send out an email after the webinar ends with a link to the recorded presentation and the PowerPoint deck. I also want to state that you should consult with your department or advisor regarding anything presented here today as it relates to your organization. We are providing the disclaimer here for our presentation. We will be providing contact information for each of us speaking at the end of the presentation today, and then the follow-up email that you will receive. I'm excited to introduce the other speakers today, Liz Denley, obviously myself from TRC, and Joel Eagle, a partner with the law firm of Thompson Hine. First, let me introduce Liz Denley. Liz is a vice president here with TRC, a chemist with 30 years of consulting experience in field, laboratory analysis and audits, quality assurance and control, data validation, and consulting with regulatory agencies. She is our national PFAS technical lead and the Quality Assurance and Chemistry Systems Director of our environmental sector. Her PFAS focus includes nomenclature, chemistry, sampling procedures, QA/QC, and laboratory analytical methodologies. Myself, I'm Melissa Hart. I am a Senior Client Service Manager and a Market Director for our Central Division and for our Security and Emergency Management Services Group. I've got over 35 years of experience in private industry as well as consulting, and I am very passionate about EPCRA reporting compliance, and also I handle CFATS, chemical facility anti-terrorism standards, as well as auditing on the EPCRA side, as well and air permitting, doing a lot of work in the pharmaceutical, chemical industries, food and beverage. And I've been really enjoying doing these PFAS TRI webinars with Liz. Next, I will introduce our third speaker, Joel Eagle. Joel is a partner in the Environmental Practice Group at the law firm of Thompson Hine. He represents public and private entities in the industrial, commercial, and manufacturing sectors, focusing his practice on all aspects of environmental law, including regulatory compliance, counseling, and litigation. Over the past several years, one of his key areas of focus has been counseling clients regarding PFAS investigation, remediation, and risk management. He also counsels clients in environmental due diligence, contract negotiation for the purpose and sale of business properties. We're very pleased to have him speaking with us today. With these introductions, let's begin the presentation.
Thanks, Missy. So today we're going to do a quick overview of PFAS and what are PFAS, talk a little bit about the sources, fate, and transport, and then we'll get into the heart of the agenda here, which is the toxics release inventory and the chemical industry and the legal issues arising from the expanding PFAS regulations. So, okay, so we'll start. I'm going to start with a very quick overview of PFAS. I know many of you have probably heard this before, but I kind of just want to make sure everybody is on the same page as we move forward. So remember that PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So let's look at the perfluoroalkyl substances first. So perfluoroalkyl substance means that the compound has a fully fluorinated alkyl tail that's saturated with fluorine. So you can see the example here for PFOA, and you can see a functional group on the right side of this molecule, here on the right side of the tail. That's the carbon and the oxygen, that's the carboxylate group. And then you see that long chain of carbons to the left of that functional group is the alkyl tail. And you can see that each carbon is fully fluorinated, or fully saturated, with fluorine. And this carbon-fluorine bond is the shortest and strongest bond in nature. which makes these compounds so persistent in the environment. Also, the functional groups at the head of these molecules, so the carboxylate group shown here, are soluble, and they are the hydrophilic head of the molecule. But the alkyl tails, which are saturated with fluorine, do not necessarily like to be in water. And these are hydrophobic tails. And this is what makes these compounds perform as great surfactants, having the soluble head and insoluble tail. So now let's look at the polyfluoroalkyl substances. So polyfluoroalkyl substance means you have a non-fluorine atom attached to at least one carbon atom in that alkane chain. So you can see in the example here that this compound only has a partially fluorinated alkyl tail. So some of those carbons where the arrows are pointed are bonded to hydrogen instead of fluorine. So it's not fully saturated with fluorine like the perfluorinated compound above. And these compounds are less stable because of these weaker carbon-hydrogen bonds. They're more open to chemical and biological degradation, and these compounds can actually form the perfluorinated compounds from a biotransformation process and are referred to as precursors. So what's pictured here is what's called a fluorotelmer, which is used as a replacement in recent years for PFOS in the aqueous film firefighting foam, AFFF, and also what we call a potential precursor because it can transform into PFOA, the perfluoroalkyl compound above. So as I just mentioned, the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in nature. These compounds are chemically, thermally stable, water-soluble, mobile in groundwater, and again, they have that unique surfactant property due to the soluble head of the molecule and insoluble tail. And they are recalcitrant in the environment. Those perfluorinated substances will not biotransform anymore. And these compounds also like to hang out at the air-water interface, which can create some challenges for sampling and analysis. Okay, so now let's just talk a little bit about sources, fate, and transport before we turn it over to Missy. So PFAS is a generic family of chemicals. There's thousands of fluorinated organic compounds. The EPA database is currently up to over 9,000 PFAS chemicals. These chemicals are man-made, they do not occur naturally, they've been in use or manufactured since about the 1940s. And we know they're used to make products that are heat resistant, oil resistant, grease and stain resistant, and waterproof. And they're used in many different industries, as you can see here. And one of the major uses of PFAS is in firefighting foam, the aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, which is used in many different industries, like at airports, petroleum refineries, military bases, chemical plants. You know, we know PFAS are used in the metal plating industry. We've seen PFAS in automobile waxes, and we've seen PFAS at car washes. PFAS are used in the electronics industry, semiconductor manufacturing industry, aerospace applications as hydraulic fluid additives. And there's many, many other uses that we just don't have time to go into today. But the bottom line is that these chemicals are just widely used, different industries and different products. And TRC, actually, we've done some work with PFAS forensics, and we've used PFAS forensics to assist in source identification. And this slide really just gives you a big picture summary of some of the different signatures we may see, which can reflect different sources and or different fate and transport scenarios. So you can see on the top left here, we can differentiate different sources of AFFF. You see a very unique signature for landfill leachate, and also a very unique signature from a plastics manufacturer. And also there's a signature here from a wastewater treatment plant effluent of a chromium plater. So these types of chemical signatures can be used to identify various characteristics, and not just of sources, but also characteristics of different fate and transport scenarios, like the breakdown of a telomere compound, like further downstream in a plume. And you can show a plume becoming more enriched in something else because of the breakdown of those precursor compounds. And now let's just look at the fate and transport of PFAS from an industrial facility. So this conceptual site model shows generally how PFAS is released from industrial facilities and the potential pathways to the environment. So you can see potential wastewater and stormwater discharges and surface water runoff. You can see potential on and off site disposal of solid waste. There could be accidental releases such as leaks and spills. And there can also be stack and fugitive emissions. And stack emissions can cause aerial deposition of PFAS to soil and surface water. And there can be both short or long range transport of PFAS. And all of these pathways that I just mentioned can result in PFAS leaching into the groundwater. And also it's important, after the industrial effluent enters the wastewater treatment plant, there's also now further pathways for PFAS to enter the environment. There can be point source discharges of effluent to surface water. There can be disposal of biosolids generated during the treatment. There could be land application of those biosolids to soil. And again, all of those pathways allow PFAS to enter the groundwater, surface water, or both. So that kind of gives you, a very quick overview of PFAS and how it can be released into the environment. And I'm now going to turn it over to Missy Hart, who is going to tell you all about the Toxics Release Inventory's PFAS rules.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate it. What we're going to get into is really kind of the in-depth now with TRI. And just as Liz presented on the conceptual model here, all the ways this can be released from a plant is really important. This is why EPA and state levels are very, very concerned about PFAS in the soil, in the groundwater, in the air. Next slide, please. For the overview, the National Defense Authorization Act basically impacted TRI for reporting year 2020, which of course is due this July 1st. It resulted in adding 172 individual PFAS chemicals to the TRI list. Very important, this is not a chemical category. You have to do an evaluation of all 172 if you have an indication that you may have these individual PFAS chemicals. So you have to do a threshold calculation for manufacture, process, or otherwise use based on the individual PFAS chemical listed in the TRI list. The threshold is 100 pounds. You may be thinking, oh gosh, that's pretty low, and maybe this is a PBT like mercury. It is not. It is not a PBT, which actually is beneficial. You can keep an eye on the de minimis levels. You can basically address the 0.1% for PFOA as a carcinogen. The rest of the 171 are going to be non-carcinogens, and therefore they have a 1% de minimis level. So you absolutely want to look at your safety data sheets. If any of the listed PFAS are below the de minimis level, they are not going to appear on your SDS. You can also contact your suppliers. By now, you probably should have received updated SDSs for any products that may contain the PFAS listings. But if you want to follow up with your supplier, make sure from the phone call or an updated SDS that you can verify that there are no PFAS listed chemicals in any of the products that you are using. Also remember, due to supplier notification, if there's confidential business information, the supplier can also provide the SDS with the generic PFAS name and just give you the upper bound concentration. As we note, 2021 is the first time that a supplier would have to give you an updated SDS if they have shipped you product before. And that is for the fact that these PFAS chemicals were added in 2020. Also note, I think that there were 3 more PFAS chemicals to make this now 175. 3 new PFAS chemicals were added for 2021 reporting. So keep an eye on this. The EPA website does give you updated lists, and they are continuing to add more and more PFAS chemicals as they come up. Next slide. I'm just going to touch on the threshold calculations that you have to do, strictly for waiting for the PFAS. And just remember, this is no different than any other threshold calculation you do for another TRI chemical. If you are manufacturing PFOA or PFOS, then you would be subject as the manufacturer. But since most of this isn't even done in the US, there may be some other PFAS chemicals that are still produced and where you would be incorporating that into your thresholds. Remember also, importing is manufacturing. That is how it's counted under EPCRA Section 313. So if you're importing any mixtures, any chemicals from out of the United States into your facility here in the United States, that is importing, you do have to consider that toward the threshold 100 pounds for manufacturing. If by chance you have a manufactured chemical such as coincidental manufacture of one PFAS that degrades into a new listed PFAS, that is also a calculation you have to perform. This would most likely happen if you were doing a remediation activity. So you really want to be careful that if you are trying to remediate a particular PFAS listed chemical and it actually creates another chemical by degrading in groundwater, you would have to do additional calculations. Next slide. For process, this is where I would probably think that process and otherwise use are the main thresholds that you'd be calculating for PFAS at your facility. When we're processing, this means that we're actually preparing a PFAS that is contained in a mixture or in a coating, and you're actually going to put this into part of your sellable product. It's being incorporated into a product that you're making at your facility to be selling to other people. Examples here would be like a Teflon coating that you're making some type of coating on site and you'll be providing it to others, and you're incorporating a PFAS listed chemical into the coating that you will now be selling. It's also if you are using a coating that contains a PFAS listed chemical and you are painting products that you have, so you're creating, stain resistance, incorporating into your carpeting, cookware, rubber plastics production. Very similar to what Liz was saying, there are so many types of operations in industrial processes where you could be using PFAS chemicals, whether they are pure or they're contained in another mixture. Next slide. Otherwise use. This is where we see a lot of the use of the AFFF firefighting foams. This is where you'll be counting the PFAS contained in those foams. Otherwise use for TRI purposes is where a chemical is used that is on the TRI list where it is not incorporated into your sellable product. It is supporting your process operations at your facility. It'd be your wastewater treatment plant, be in boilers. It would be coatings that you are using on process equipment that might contain Teflon, that might contain PFAS listed chemicals, but it is just being used to take care of your process equipment, but it is not in your sellable product. We have seen this used in chrome plating as mist suppression, chromic acid anodizing. Obviously, it's contained in some firefighting foams. Those are foams that you would be actually using for training, where you were doing training on site. They use the foam during certain times of the year. Or if you unfortunately had a fire or an emergency response operation at your facility and you had to spray the foam. That is where you would be otherwise using a PFAS AFFF foam. If you, again, the coatings is a big issue. For TRI purposes, coatings get lost many times on otherwise use when you're actually painting pumps and connectors and piping systems, just to make sure that they're operating and they're staying up to speed and lengthening their life. If they contain PFAS, you now have another calculation that you have to do. Of particular note, always remember that storing a toxic chemical that is on the TRI list does not mean you are manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using. Same for AFFF. If you have PFAS containing AFFF foams on site, as long as it's just sitting in the firefighting equipment on site, you do not have to count it for a threshold calculation. You are not reporting it. The only time is if you are actually using it for training or firefighting purposes, or let's say if you unfortunately had a spill, that is when you would do a calculation. But you have to trigger one of the thresholds before you calculate releases. Next slide. When we talk about the challenges that we're seeing for TRI purposes is, most importantly, a lot of SDSs do not contain the PFAS information we're used to seeing for other chemicals. So you really want to make sure you have the latest and greatest SDS. There's also limited PFAS analytical methods in laboratories capable of analysis. But where that would affect you as a user of PFAS chemicals, you are not required to go send out products that you use to a lab to have them test to see if PFAS is in it. That isn't your job. You are not having to reanalyze to determine if it is contained in those products. You want to make sure that you use the latest list. As I said, we have 172 for 2020 reporting year. There are 3 new chemicals that are added for 2021. Do you want to keep a running list as to what's contained in your products? So you should have been tracking for this last calendar year. Obviously, if you're using a consultant to help out with your TRI calculations or your reporting, there are some PFAS tracking tools that are available that you can utilize to verify if there are PFAS in any of the mixtures or products that you are using. As always, for TRI, document everything you can. If you have conversations on phone or via email with your supplier, they're telling you that there are no PFAS, no listed PFAS in your particular mixtures or coatings or additives or intermediates, document that, put it in the file, and move on. Next slide, please. We get to calculating thresholds. Remember, number 1, you have to first meet the 3 criteria for reporting for TRI. Your number of FTE, 10 people or more, your covered NAICS code, and then have you triggered 100 pounds for manufacture, process, or otherwise use. Those thresholds have to be done for each listed PFAS that is on the TRI list. And in most cases, you're going to be looking at processing or otherwise use. You want to make sure, are you making a PFAS chemical or creating another one from an ancillary process? If that's the case, you would trigger for manufacturer. If you're incorporating into your sellable product, that is processing. If you're using it on site to maintain your equipment, you're not incorporating it into your sellable product, then we're at otherwise use. It is the same approach you use for all other TRI reporting of chemicals. And when we talk about like closed loop process systems, if you have your firefighting equipment, and let's say it has a AFFF foam that contains PFAS and it's been sitting in the equipment for 5 years, and you decide in 2020 that you're going to take it out, dispose of it, and put in fresh new foam. Just simply disposing of it does not mean you have triggered TRI reporting. If that exact same PFAS in the AFFF foam was used in another process where you exceeded the 100-pound threshold, now you might want to consider the fact that you now have to report that as a release and where you disposed of it. But you have to trip the threshold first. And most importantly, use all the de minimis exemptions and activity exemptions you can for PFAS chemicals. You do get to take advantage of that. And in many cases, PFAS is in less than de minimis levels in a lot of products. Next slide. For release reporting, again, just like any other TRI chemical, once you trigger a threshold for the specific listed PFAS, you then report all the releases of that specific PFAS. So you're looking at air, water, land, just like the slide that Liz posted for fate and transport. Take a look at everything. Where does it go? Is it being recycled? Is it being transferred off-site? Include your spills, accidental releases. Also look at ongoing remediation activities. But remember, if you are not manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using a listed PFAS, there is not a reporting threshold that applies to a cleanup action. So if you haven't used any of those and you're dealing with a remediation activity where it happens to be present, that doesn't mean that you're reporting it on a Form R. The one time where you might have to consider is if you are treating groundwater that has PFAS in it and it has degraded where you have actually created another PFAS chemical. You want to take a look at this. You want to make sure and evaluate that. Next slide. I'm going to hand this over to Joel. Joel is going to be taking a look at legal issues that arise from the expanding PFAS regulations and not just TRI. Thank you, Joel.
Thanks, Missy, and thanks, Liz. I do a lot of PFAS speaking, and there are two challenges that I confront in doing a PFAS presentation. The first is there are so many legal issues. It's often difficult to decide what to speak about and how much time to spend on a particular PFAS issue. And second, the pace of change on the legal side is so great that what you learn about one day or seen in the news may be stale or have somewhat changed by the next day. And it's no different with this presentation. By the time we had finalized the presentation, within a couple of days, there were some fairly substantial changes at the EPA and at the state level. So I will be getting into a couple of those during my presentation. Next slide, please. So as Liz and Missy have explained, PFAS is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous is the descriptor that is used most frequently. Whoever started using that should have coined it and made a lot of money. But ubiquitous is a very accurate way of describing PFAS in the environment and why EPA and states are so interested in regulating the compounds today. The momentum for PFAS regulation has been growing year over year. It is certainly not new from this year or last year or the last couple of years, but we're reaching I don't know if there will be a peak, but we continue to gain momentum in all the legal and technical issues that PFAS are raising. I'll take a step back. This slide talks about the current Biden administration's focus on PFAS, but taking one step back, PFAS has been on EPA's radar, the US EPA's radar, for several years, culminating in 2019 in EPA issuing the first iteration of its federal PFAS action plan, which had a variety of different goals and aspirations for regulating or studying PFAS, including TRI, which had not yet been passed by the 2020 NDAA, but there were many other statutes and concepts that the 2019 action plan focused on, which I'm going to touch upon in a minute. The action plan from 2019 was updated in 2020 with the EPA's progress. In 2019, Congress first proposed the 2019 PFAS Action Act. It passed through the House, but it didn't go anywhere in the Senate. But most recently, last week, the House reintroduced the PFAS Action Act. It's now called the 2021 PFAS Action Act, but it's identical in substance, and it's going to be moving through Congress with a changing dynamic in the House and Senate. There seems to be a greater likelihood that the act or some form of the act will pass. It does have some bipartisan support right now, but if passed in its current iteration and in the bill that's proposed, there are several major changes that will occur. First of which would be that it would require EPA to establish national drinking water standards for two of the PFAS compounds, PFOA and PFOS, which Liz talked about, within 2 years, which would be a significant development. Another significant development would be the requirement to list PFOS and PFOA as circular hazardous substances within 1 year, but also requiring EPA to continue to evaluate other PFAS and decide within 5 years whether other PFAS compounds should be listed as hazardous substances. The PFAS Action Act would also designate PFOS and PFOA as hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act within 180 days. And as Liz showed you in the conceptual site model, air emissions are certainly one of the forms by which environmental and human health exposures of PFAS may occur. So there's more to the PFAS Action Act, but those are some of the highlights. In the Biden campaign, he issued an environmental justice plan that specifically called out PFAS. This on the screen, you see a quote essentially saying that although the EPA had issued the 2019 PFAS action plan, there's a pretty strong statement here that instead of making empty promises with no follow through, that Biden would tackle PFAS as we talked about just now with the Action Act, designating certain PFAS as hazardous substances and setting maximum contaminant levels under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but also continuing toxicity studies, because as you'll hear over and over again, not all PFAS are the same. Liz mentioned 9,000 or more PFAS compounds. You see lots of different numbers, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 different compounds, but right now the EPA database shows over 9,000, and it would be scientifically inaccurate to just lump all PFAS together into a single category and designate all 9,000 as hazardous substances or set MCLs for all of them. One more point with the Biden administration, with the recent appointment of Michael Regan as the new head of EPA, the administrator. Michael Regan has a history of PFAS enforcement. When he was the secretary of the North Carolina Environmental Department, he has, in his Senate confirmation and other pre-confirmation statements, he said he would be prioritizing PFAS, and now that he is sworn in, he has taken prompt action with statements about a continued goal of PFAS enforcement and regulation. Another of Michael Regan's priorities and Biden's priorities in the environmental space is environmental justice. So I would see that PFAS in low-income or minority communities will also be of focus. Just last week, the EPA issued a proposed budget. It includes a 21% increase overall from the previous year, from 9.2 billion to 11.2 billion, and a lot of that is going to go toward issues like environmental justice. $1.4 billion would be allocated to environmental justice, and specifically PFAS is called out for over 75 million, which would go toward toxicity studies and to also help with the MCL, Safe Drinking Water Act designations. So what you can see here is that the actions over the last several years at the federal level have been very focused on PFAS, and that we're just likely going to see a whole new level in the Biden administration. Next slide, please. So it should not be surprising at this point to see that the focus on PFAS at the federal level is going to permeate into essentially every environmental statute. This slide lists each of the statutes. Won't go through all of them in detail, but what you can see here is that because PFAS is so ubiquitous and will impact every environmental statute, you're going to see either changes in statutes or regulations to address PFAS, or if, for example, PFOS and PFOA or other PFAS compounds become circular hazardous substances, that will in and of itself trigger cleanup actions, remedial investigations, and other obligations. Certainly under the Toxic Substances and Control Act, TSCA, PFAS has already seen a fair amount of activity in terms of toxicity studies, orders for new uses, and significant new use rules. And that's likely to continue. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the litigation of PFAS in a moment, so I will hold off on that, other than to say that the breadth of types of claims, causes of action in PFAS litigation to date is pretty much the full range of what you could possibly imagine in terms of property damage and personal injury. There are new claims out there about consumer products, false marketing, stating that something biodegrades, for example, when in fact it has PFAS and does not readily biodegrade. And then, of course, remediation sites that have contamination are being the subject of lawsuits for not just actual remediation, but natural resource damages and medical monitoring. The list goes on and on. On the EPCRA side, one of the big issues that is of concern to the regulated community is, as Missy explained, this is the first time, this is the first year that parties that are subject to TRI reporting are required to list PFAS as part of the reporting. There is knowledge of PFAS in the environment in some locations, but this will be the first time that the public has full access to what PFAS is being entered into the environment across the country. So what does this mean? This means that EPA and states will have access to this data. This could lead to further scrutiny in terms of enforcement actions, but it could also lead to citizen suits to the extent that the purpose of citizen suits is for citizens to have opportunities to enforce environmental laws if it's determined that the federal or state agency is not taking certain action. In the case of PFAS, reading the tea leaves, I would suggest that this is a real possibility. In the past, we make prognostications of citizen suit increases, and for example, during the Trump administration, that perhaps enforcement would go down and citizen suits would therefore go up. That didn't necessarily happen nationwide, but I do think that the writing is on the wall for PFAS to lead to additional to new citizen suits. So the takeaway here is it's just critical to understand what risk you have from either past usage or current usage of PFAS, and to the extent that your investigations uncover risks, to develop plans, management plans, or action plans to address them. Of course, there's options for being proactive and reactive, and in many cases, taking a more proactive approach is the safer approach, just because you're able to get in front of issues and potentially mitigate issues before they arise. Next slide, please. So I've covered at the federal level, how PFAS is being addressed and regulated or proposed for regulation. The states are really taking their own action, and in many cases taking the lead. There's a sense that the federal government has not done enough or has not acted quickly enough, and therefore you see many states using their own powers to regulate PFAS. This slide is just a snapshot of some states that have already taken some action for setting drinking water maximum contaminant levels, or taking some other action such as remediation standards. The states in green are worth a particular focus, because these are the states that have already set MCLs and very low MCLs. Typically, MCLs are in the parts per million or parts per billion range, but PFAS is regulated at the state level at the part per trillion range. You see New York is all the way down to 10 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA. New Jersey is at 14 and 13. I would like to have a conversation with Liz about how you could really differentiate between 10 and 13 parts per trillion, but clearly these levels are very low, and other states are continuing to evaluate whether they should be establishing MCLs or other emission standards. And at the top of the screen, you see US EPA, of course, does not have MCLs yet, but for many years has operated under a non-binding health advisory level, or a HAL, of 70 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA combined. So more to come. I saw news that Wisconsin is going to be taking additional action or proposing additional action, and the takeaway for this slide is to understand and to be up to speed on what the levels and the regulations are in a particular state, because it's not just a federal program. Next slide, please. So PFAS litigation has been in the news for many years now. There have been several attorney general lawsuits that have resulted in settlements. Minnesota had a settlement that was a total of $850 million. Ohio has had a settlement at $671 million. In the top of the screen, the bullet in green is particularly interesting because in this case, this is a proposed nationwide class action that would cover every individual in the United States that has PFAS in their bloodstream above a very low level. And the estimate is that if the class is certified, that you could have virtually the entire country as part of the class. So that's obviously a big deal. Another state that has taken prompt and tough action in the litigation sphere is New Jersey. Last November, the state of New Jersey filed a lawsuit against a couple of companies for a PFAS contamination at a specific site. The levels in groundwater on-site and off-site were many orders of magnitude above the New Jersey MCL. And that case will proceed, but the claims in that case, as I mentioned a little bit ago, include natural resource damages, remediation, and state environmental statutes for cleanups. And then even more recently, New Jersey filed a lawsuit against the Department of Defense in early 2021 for PFAS contamination at 3 separate Air Force bases in New Jersey. The Department of Defense is often spoken of as the elephant in the room regarding PFAS because of AFFF usage at Air Force bases for training exercises and actual fires over the years. So there are known DoD sites across the country with PFAS contamination. So New Jersey has filed suit, and do not think that it will be the last state to do so. I don't know if this is really the first phase of litigation, but we'll call it, the last 5 to 10 years have focused on several, but not many of the top manufacturers and users of PFAS. But as we've heard, PFAS is ubiquitous in terms of its usage across various industries, and we are starting to see litigation at a next level of industries and individual companies. Next slide, please. So the takeaways here are, we are at the tip of the iceberg on all of these legal issues, litigation and laws and regulations, toxicity evaluations. Don't have time to talk about it today, but water discharge permitting is another focus at the state and federal level. We'll likely see some permitting requirements in the near future for certain PFAS compounds. So although the tip of the iceberg is fairly high above the water right now, there's also a lot below the surface that has not yet risen, but will soon. PFAS is not just a issue in the United States; it is a worldwide issue. Europe, Asia, Australia, every continent and most countries have begun to take focus, to take action to address PFAS in the environment and in products. I've talked about the options between being reactive and proactive, but of course, the risk of being reactive is at times you may simply receive a complaint filed against your company and have to scramble at that point. But of course, resources are always limited, so evaluations up front to understand what your risks are is a option to take. I do want to talk just briefly about the attorney-client privilege, conducting investigations for PFAS. If you do decide to choose a proactive path, performing investigations with the support of counsel is your best opportunity to protect your investigation under the attorney-client privilege, or perhaps under the litigation work product doctrine. Not everything will be covered by a privilege, but it's clear that if you don't attempt upfront to do an investigation with legal closely involved, that you don't stand a chance of making an attorney-client privilege argument or a work product argument later on. I did not coin the problem for all states acronym, but it's certainly true that states have taken their own action. The federal government has worked under the concept of cooperative federalism, giving the states authority as well. But at this point, it's sort of a two-headed monster of regulations and impacts coming from all angles. So with that happy note, I will conclude my remarks by thanking you all for listening and turn it back over to TRC.
Thanks, Joel. Really appreciate it. Great part of the presentation there. And thank you, Liz, for yours as well. We do have some time remaining to answer some questions from the audience. Christian, are you going to be handling any questions that have come in?
Yes, we do have some questions. So if that's okay with everyone, we'll go ahead and just get started.
Perfect.
The first question we have is, am I correct that since PFAS are not considered to be PBTs, that they are subject to the article exemption? For example, fluoropolymers in water filters.
I can answer that one. Yes, since they are not PBTs, you can take advantage of any of the exemptions that currently apply for TRI chemicals. So yes, if it's incorporated into the article and it is not something that can come out, you can treat that as an article, meet the article exemption, and move on. Yay.
Great, thanks.
Great question.
The next question that we have is, does the 100-pound threshold apply to each PFAS individually or to the chemical group as a whole?
It applies to each chemical individually, and that's very important, because if you had a category, you could come up to the 100-pound threshold a whole lot easier. So it is not a chemical category. Each individual chemical that is listed has 100 pounds applying to it.
Okay, the next question that we have is, does the EPA consider the 172 PFAS persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic?
No, they are not PBT chemicals.
And does that have any impact on the reporting requirements then?
Yes, basically the 172 and the next three that have been for 2021. So ultimately for 2021 reporting, we'll have 175. They are not PBT chemicals. Therefore, they are subject to de minimis exemption, article exemption, all the exemptions you need. Take advantage of them. so that you can minimize your reporting burden if you have the available information showing that you can exempt them out and not consider them for thresholds or release reporting purposes.
Okay, so the next question is, do facilities need to account for PFAS potentially in water from wells or groundwater used in processes?
That's a really good question. Got to be careful here. So, there is an intake water exemption in TRI because, the intake water exemption says that if you're pulling in water from outside of your facility and it's already got contaminants in there that are on the TRI list, like, let's say it's got some lead or it's got beryllium or something else that is present in there, that you are not responsible to report for stuff that's already in there that has come in. But if you are like, let's say that you have some groundwater that is contaminated and you're basically handling it from a cleanup action, and that there are listed TRI chemicals after the treatment that you're doing, that you're sending off site for disposal, is the facility required to report? You have to, TRI, remember, you don't look at the end run and releases when you look at TRI first. You have to first determine, have I manufactured, processed, or otherwise used a TRI chemical? And if I have, then I do the threshold calculation for that chemical, and that could be one of the PFAS listed. And if I have tripped the threshold, then I look at releases of just that chemical. So the thing is if TRI PFAS chemicals are not manufactured, processed, or otherwise used at your facility, then there would be no reporting threshold that applies for a cleanup action that you were doing on site. If you are manufacturing, processed, and otherwise using certain listed PFAS chemicals at your facility elsewhere and you exceed a threshold, then you would take up and review releases and any waste management activities that might be generated from this cleanup action if that toxic chemical is the same PFAS that you had tripped it for somewhere else in the facility. So when you send remediation waste offsite for waste management, that's where you would list it. It would not meet an intake water exemption because the chemicals that are not being used are not from a process activity. So I hope that answers that question. It can get pretty deep. That is something we can obviously answer in more detail if you want to send us a note specifically about it, but you have to trip the threshold first, then you look at your releases.
Great. Okay, so the next question we have is, if PFAS are present in equipment not consumed but in contact with process, could that be considered?
Okay. Let's say that you bought a pump and a compressor and a storage tank from from a supplier. You bought it ready-made, you installed it at your facility, and they're all three painted with a coating that is stain and water resistant. So it's basically got PFAS in that coating, but it's already been sprayed on and you just brought it to your facility. No, those are articles. You are not doing any reporting. It has nothing to do with TRI. Now, let's say 5 years later, you decide you have some scratches because somebody had the random forklift and smacked into it, and you've got some bare metal showing, and you're like, oh man, I got to do some touch-up painting. So I scrape off the primer and the old paint around it, and then I touch it up with some primer and I put another coating on it. I'm spraying coating and it contains PFAS. Now I have hit otherwise use. So you would take however much paint and primer that contain the PFAS, and you would pull the PFAS out of that. And if that adds up to 100 pounds, you have to report it on your Form R. if you trip 100 pounds for that specific PFAS contained in that coating, and then your release calculations might be, did anything go to air? Did you spill a bunch of it on the ground? You know what? And then you scraped it up and put it in the trash. That's what you would do for your calculation. But if it's present on equipment, process equipment, or anything else where you're not the one that applied it, you would not have any type of a calculation. You would have to be actually using coatings or greases or hydraulic fluids or anything else you're maintaining at your facility for process equipment, where you'd actually be incorporating that into the equipment. That is where you would maybe have a threshold triggered for otherwise use.
Okay, and then I think we have time for just one more question, and kind of segues nicely from the end of your answer of the last one, Missy. Are there any other examples you can give for otherwise use of PFAS?
Let me think. We talked about coatings. Obviously, the other use would be, and we kind of talked about coatings, but like, Liz was talking about hydraulic fluid. You're using that to type off hydraulic equipment. Let's say you have hydraulic equipment and then you decide to change out and you have a new supplier and you're going in with a different vendor, and now you're using some other new vendor to supply hydraulic fluids. You would want to check about that. So you're going to have to take a look at, in so many cases, PFAS can be present in so many different products that you really have to look at your lubes and greases and refrigeration equipment. I mean, if you have you want to take a look at coatings that you use for processes, for coating tanks and piping, and just basically, doing your upkeep in your maintenance areas and in your overall facility process equipment. A lot of times maybe you're redoing piping, or you're spraying your outdoor tank farm. You decided you're going to paint things a different color. You have to take a look at all the coatings being used. And so, you just want to make sure, and you'd be doing this. Remember, you're going to be doing this anyway for coatings, especially if you got toluene and xylene and copper pigments or anything in paint. You would be doing that anyway. So now we're just adding on another set of chemicals that may or may not be in there. But a lot of your coatings and a lot of your fluids, these are pretty specialty items. These are going to be heavier duty. They're going to be, beefier coatings, beefier fluids. That's where you want to take a look to make sure that there isn't any other PFAS. Obviously, firefighting foams. Numerous states that, Joel was even talking about, numerous states are passing legislation where they are saying you can't incorporate PFAS into your firefighting foams, but those aren't going to take place for a couple of years from now. And that's on the manufacturing end. So you do need to take a look at what type of firefighting foams you have on site. You can get them changed out and then just dispose of the PFAS foam on its own, where you're not triggering it in any other manner for Form R reporting, but you're just changing it out to a newer firefighting foam that does not have PFAS.
Okay,
but
great.
You got to look at, you got to look at process cleaners and sanitizers. I mean, there's just so many things. It's hard to go through it, but anything that you just remember, anything you're using that does not go into your sellable product, not incorporated into the product you are making and selling for public commercial use, is going to be an otherwise use threshold calculation.
Okay, so we didn't have a chance to get to your questions again. We'll follow up with you directly. And if you have any questions that you just want to reach out to one of our presenters with following the webinar, we encourage you to do so. Thank you to all of our presenters today, and thank you to everybody for attending. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.